Hello, welcome, good afternoon everybody. It's great to see so many people interested in this topic, in this lecture today. Welcome. My name is Uğur Üngör. The microphones are definitely on. No? Okay, they're on to me. My name is Uğur Üngör. I'm professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the NIOT and at the University of Amsterdam. And I'm happy to welcome you to our annual lecture on Holocaust and Genocide Studies. It is my great honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Martin Shaw, research professor at the Institut Barcelona de Estudis Internacionals, and emeritus professor of international relations and politics at the University of Sussex in the UK. He's one of the world's foremost scholars on the concept of genocide and a pioneering figure in the fields of war, state violence, and global politics. Over the past decades, he has carved out a unique place in the intellectual landscape through his contributions, his books, his articles, his public engagement, which have profoundly shaped how we think not only about genocide, but also about war, about human rights, and about international relations. Professor Shaw's work on genocide is particularly notable because it pushes the boundaries of established definitions, and it compels us to rethink both historical and contemporary atrocities. His two books, What is Genocide, 2007, and War and Genocide, have become seminal texts by proposing sociological frameworks for understanding genocide as an aspect of modern conflicts, rather than an isolated, extraordinary phenomenon. In these works, Professor Shaw argues for a more nuanced understanding that connects genocides to the broader patterns of political violence and war that characterize our world. So he contextualizes genocide and takes it out of its echo chamber, out of its bubble. And the challenge is always to relate war and genocide and not to segregate them. Nothing is more relevant than this, and certainly to us as an institute that carries the concept of war and genocide in its title, the Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. But also because it is 2024, and Professor Shaw's research is now more topical than ever. In an era of rising authoritarianism, contested memory politics, and ongoing very violent conflicts, his insights into how states mobilize violence, the role of ideology and the international community as a response to mass atrocities, offer crucial perspectives. His work forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about genocide, reminding us that it's not a relic of the past, but it's a constant threat in today's world. He has been an outspoken voice on contemporary issues, drawing attention to ongoing cases of state violence that, though sometimes labeled differently, often bears the hallmarks of genocidal processes. So for this annual lecture on genocide, it is hard to imagine a more fitting speaker. Professor Shaw's intellectual and moral clarity and consistency, and his unwavering commitment to advancing our understanding of mass violence, make him the ideal person to lead us in this important reflection. Finally, he's also a Yorkshireman, so Yorkshire, it's the north of the UK, and I know from personal experience that over there they say it as it is, and they call a spade a spade. We will listen to his lecture. After that, we will have a question and answer. Please join me in welcoming Professor Martin Shaw.
Well, thank you very much. I'll try to live up to that introduction. Thank you especially, Professor Unger and the Institute for inviting me here today to deliver this annual lecture, which is obviously an important institution in the Institute and indeed in Amsterdam. I'm going to start by noting the dates. We are in October 2024, and almost exactly 80 years ago, in November 1944, the Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin published a book called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. And this was the book in which he introduced the idea of genocide. So the idea of genocide is exactly 8 decades old this coming month. He published this in Washington, D.C. And you may not need to remind you that in the Netherlands at the same time, what came to become the Hungerwinter was beginning. And there is a connection between these two events. Although the famine had multiple causes, it follows, of course, from Germany's occupation policies in this country, which Lemkin included in his survey of Nazi genocide in this book. Moreover, although Lemkin wrote before the Hunger Winter, he regarded the rationing of food on racial lines as the principal means by which the Nazis carried out the physical debilitation and even annihilation of national groups in occupied countries, which was one of the key components of his idea of genocide. And he showed that already in 1943, according to a publication that he cited, the Dutch received only 70% of the rations that went to the Germans, but others received much less. Many Poles in the general government zone of occupation received only 36%. Jews in Warsaw received 20%, and Jews in the general government, none at all. And historians have confirmed the importance of starvation as a means of the Nazi genocide. The American historian Christopher Browning, in a famous book, The Path to Genocide, has written that if Hitler's regime had ceased to exist in 1942, its historical infamy would have rested not so much on the annihilation of the Jews as on the mass death from hunger and cold of 2 million Soviet prisoners of war in the previous winter following the invasion of the Soviet Union. So this is something of the background to the idea of genocide, and I'll come back to one of these points as we go along. But overall, of course, the intentional destruction of populations by Germany and other defeated powers of the Second World War was of such a character and scale that the new United Nations, which was only just then coming into existence as a result of the alliance of the major anti-Nazi powers, this destruction of populations was of such of a character and scale that the UN adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide on the 9th of December 1948. And this was just 4 years after Lemkin had published his book. A really remarkable achievement for an academic who had had to flee his own country to seek safety in the United States. However, the drafting of the convention involves some compromises, and these are important to recognize because today the convention is the main reference point for the definition of genocide, and you will see in the debates which are going on at the present time frequent references to the convention and the way in which it is being interpreted by the International Court of Justice in particular. So the compromises that were involved were several. There was no reference to the destruction of culture, and this was something which Lemkin regarded as central to genocide. So from his point of view, this was a major lack. And since the UN Convention confined genocide to the destruction of what it called national, ethnical, racial, and religious groups, the destruction of what was called at the time political groups, that's to say populations or groups of people defined by their political identities, was not covered by this new convention, something which many later scholars have complained about, but Lemkin actually wasn't quite so bothered by. And there were other major exclusions. The forced removal of populations was deliberately omitted from the list of genocidal means, not only despite the fact that this was the primary method by which national and ethnic groups were being destroyed in the late 1940s when the convention was adopted, but also because this was the primary method. The great powers, and even the UN itself, were complicit in massive, violent forced removals of populations which were destroying whole communities as they existed in their homelands, from Eastern Europe to India and also Palestine. Above all, a line was being drawn when the convention was adopted between genocide on the one hand and the systematic killing of civilians by bombing on the other. And this was because, although the Germans had killed large numbers of civilians in places like Rotterdam, the victorious Allies had actually practiced this on a much greater scale, culminating in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this was out with the convention and the idea of genocide as laid out in the late 1940s. And worse than this in some ways, although the UN great powers had restricted the wording of the convention in these various ways, for them it remained, the historian Mark Mazower has commented, a promissory note that was not intended to be cashed. They weren't really interested in seeing this new convention enforced because it potentially posed lots of problems for the ways in which they were carrying out their own rule, in cases varying from the repression of Stalin's Soviet Union to the exploitation of the colonies in the British Empire. So for all sorts of reasons, the great powers were not so much committed to the convention as we might have hoped, and to its actual enforcement. So as a result of this, they failed to establish the International Criminal Court. We now have an International Criminal Court, of course, which has been going now for 20 years or so, but this was envisaged in the 1940s, but it never happened until well after the Cold War was ended. And not only did they not establish the International Criminal Court, before long, the great powers of the United Nations, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, were condoning genocidal episodes carried out by their own allies, if not by themselves. And this was a normal part of Cold War politics. So you might say that the idea of genocide had unpromising beginnings, or at least after a promising beginning, it very quickly went off the track. But it not only survived, but it actually grew in influence. And it escaped from the chancelleries into the discourse of civil society. So ordinary people like us, those of us in this room, and various movements and organizations and groups that were set up embraced the idea of genocide and began to use it in critical ways. And this was partly because the atrocities that the idea conjured up continued to happen. As I said, they were often committed by powers, states, regimes linked to the great powers in the United Nations. But while political leaders often looked the other way, advocates for victim groups and human rights were taking up the cry. So genocide became an important idea. The other reason it became important, though, was the power of the idea itself, which had driven Lemkin from his first steps in the 1930s, actually. It was in the 1930s that he first started to think about genocide in the way which we find in the convention, to his campaigning for that convention at the end of the Second World War. And this was the sense that the systematic destruction of population groups, while it often occurred during wars, was ultimately quite different from war as it was conventionally understood, at least as it was recognized as a legitimate practice. And therefore, this systematic destruction of populations needed to be recognized in its own right with a particular idea, a particular concept, and a new name. And that was really where Lemkin came from, and that is why I think his idea was so powerful, even when states were turning their backs on it in the Cold War period. Sorry, I seem to have forgotten actually that I have one or two illustrations. I'm not doing a PowerPoint presentation, but I do have some illustrations. This is actually Lemkin's book with its plain red cover as it was published in 1944. So before I leave it behind altogether, I thought you'd better see this image. I'm going to leave this stage of the argument behind a little now, because I want to point out that, of course, not long after the idea of genocide emerged, a new idea began to take center stage. A decade after the Nazis' extermination of the European Jews had played a key role in the adoption of the convention. Clearly this was the main moral lesson which drove the UN to adopt the convention. This extermination began to be known by a new name, the Holocaust. And of course, for many Jews, it was the Shoah, the Hebrew word for catastrophe. And this idea of the Holocaust became more and more powerful. It was driven partly by what we can call cultural recognition. And one of the earliest signs of this was the way in which the diary of Anne Frank, written in the city, of course, was translated into English and other international languages and became a powerful story of the terrible things that happened during the Nazi genocide. But as a result of not only of this, but of many other cultural and to some extent political processes, the Holocaust became, during the late 20th century, what the sociologist Jeffrey Alexander has called a sacred evil, a transcendent manifestation of human beings' inhumanity to each other. And the Holocaust also became the dominant idea when academics began to grapple with mass atrocity. Indeed, you'll notice that it precedes genocide in the title of this lecture series. Historians produced an impressive amount of research on the Holocaust, which scholarship on other genocides simply did not match for a very long time. And I recall that when I first got involved in this field about 25 years ago, and I went to my university library to prepare my first course on genocide, I found something like 500 titles on the Holocaust and about 50 on all the other genocides combined. And this was really the weight of scholarship in that period. And this meant, of course, that the scholarship on the Holocaust was richer and that it had many lessons for understanding other genocides. But the fact that the field of genocide studies emerged in the shadow of the Holocaust, often through an extended process of recognition where advocates for the recognition of other genocides referred them back to the Holocaust and tried to compare them and show similarities. This also caused problems, I think, for the idea of genocide. Because the Holocaust as a standard of genocide further distorted Lemkin's idea, which had already been modified by the Convention's definition. Genocide began to be equated simplistically with mass murder, which was a departure which went way beyond the Convention's modifications of Lemkin. And indeed was in a sense a distortion of the Holocaust itself, because the Holocaust did not begin when the Nazis began the systematic mass murder in the extermination camps. The Holocaust was already underway in the years before that, as the Nazis gradually escalated their anti-Jewish campaign and began systematic mass killing in other ways before the camps reached their peak. So the idea of genocide as simply mass killing was an oversimplification. But this oversimplification became quite powerful, and new terms like ethnic cleansing and later politicide and gendercide and others were invented to cover what Lemkin would have regarded as part of the problem of genocide. And these dimensions, the forced removal of populations, the destruction of political elites, and so on, were then excluded from the genocide paradigm itself. And the result of this was that in the period after the Cold War, when studies of political violence, mass atrocity, and human rights were growing exponentially, and this is when really these fields became important in academia and began to influence the wider society, the idea of genocide became an increasingly unsatisfactory presence often dispensed with in particular studies, but still seemingly indispensable to the field as a whole. And from where I'm standing, this situation hasn't really changed, because attempts to shift the dial, sometimes by promoting these alternative concepts, and other cases like mine by trying to provide a more rational foundation, more coherent foundation for the idea of genocide itself, none of these have actually fundamentally altered this tension within these fields that study these sorts of problems. And it was therefore tempting for people to treat the idea of genocide merely as a political resource which actors used, and of course actors did use it, both advocates for victim groups and also sometimes others with less noble motives who distorted the idea of genocide. So people started to regard the idea of genocide as something which was used in political practice and should be studied in that context, but not as an analytical concept, not as a concept which should be used objectively by social scientists and historians and lawyers to describe crimes of violence against populations, the original idea. And while these sorts of processes were going on in social science and historical academia, similar process was happening in international law. Despite the defects of the convention which academic discussion highlighted, it did sufficiently represent Lemkin's original idea to become a viable means of charging perpetrators, to the extent that a legal apparatus and the will to use it existed. So whatever we can say about the convention, and everyone has criticisms of it, nevertheless, it did remain a powerful legal instrument. But when it came to the crunch, when in cases like the genocidal destruction that happened in former Yugoslavia, when these cases started to come to international courts, to the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia first of all, and later to the International Court of Justice, prosecutors were often aware of the political context, the difficult political context around the idea of genocide, and shied away from bringing genocide charges. And even when they were brought, judges were often reluctant to uphold these charges. So the convention had made it quite difficult in the first place for courts to convict leaders or states of the crime of genocide. But the judges pushed the threshold even higher. Wait, I should have had that up before. I'll come back to that in a moment, but just let me show you this picture. Where have I gone to? There. Sorry. I'm pushing this for higher because I wanted to show you Philippe Sands. So I'm not doing very well with my slides, but I apologize. Philippe Sands, who's a very well-known international lawyer, in a lecture at the Imperial War Museum in London earlier this year, argued that the judges in the International Court of Justice had pushed the criteria for the threshold for convicting people of genocide, for finding states guilty of genocide, even higher than the convention itself had specified, and therefore made it almost impossible for states and their leaders to be found guilty of the crime. So, we go back. In this context, it's not surprising that the questioning of the idea of genocide grew apace and was renewed again when this book was published by the respected scholar Dirk Moses in 2021. Now, Dirk is the editor of the Journal of Genocide Research, which is the most respected genocide journal, and he's been an advocate of critical genocide studies for the last 20 or 30 years. But in 2021, he argued that we should dispense with the whole idea of genocide. And it's an argument that we have to take seriously, particularly seriously, because unlike some other critics of the idea, he actually knows his stuff, and he went back to the idea of genocide in Lemkin's work and exposed some contradictions in it. And one of these contradictions, you may not be surprised to hear, was that Lemkin had brought together in his single concept of the Nazi genocide the partial crippling of the population in countries like the Netherlands with the mass murder of the European Jews. And Moses sees this as a political move on Lemkin's part. He was trying to get support for the idea of genocide and for his convention, and he thought that if he could show that it applied to a wider range of cases, then there would be more support for it, whereas if it was simply about the plight of the Jews, it would not be so widely supported. He therefore concludes that genocide, as the idea has been transmitted to us from Lemkin via the United Nations Convention, is not only an unstable concept, but is inherently unstable, and therefore must be replaced by a new overarching idea, permanent security. And his idea of permanent security is this. It's the idea that states target populations with violence because they believe that if they only eliminate the whole population, maybe even including the children of that population, they will permanently remove particular kind of security threats which they identify with particular population groups. So this is how Moses explains the idea of permanent security, and he believes that this is a more powerful overall idea than the idea of genocide. And I introduce this to you because this is really an important part of the current state of debate in the genocide field. And I agree with the first part of this case. Lemkin proposed a broad concept in which the relationships between the different elements was inadequately explained, and the convention in many ways exacerbated the problems of Lemkin's idea. So in this sense, the original version was to some extent unstable. But I don't think that the conclusion that we should dispense with genocide and replace it with a new idea follows from these imperfections of its historic formulations. To establish that, I think it would be necessary to examine later attempts to make it more coherent, but Moses does not do this. Similarly, the fact that the idea of genocide is often abused does not mean it cannot be used constructively to analyze and prevent civilian harm. We have to distinguish between the rational core of the idea and the unfortunate way in which it's abused in some cases. And I would argue, in fact, that it could be the concept of war which is unstable. Moses, like many other writers, seem to treat war as a almost a natural force of human affairs and of world politics, and not to question its underlying rationale. And it seems to me part of the problem is that almost all contemporary warfare is degenerate in the sense of departing from the ideal type of conflict between armed forces and states, which is legitimate in international relations. And almost all warfare today systematically produces civilian harm in different ways, of which genocide is one. So I think we can turn this argument around and say that actually the idea of war is potentially more unstable than that of genocide. However, Philippe Sands, the international lawyer, in his lecture, he draws much the same conclusion as Moses. In his case, it's out of his frustration with international law, having failed in an attempt as an advocate for Croatia in a case against Serbia, to get the International Court of Justice to lower the threshold for genocide. And despite noting that Ireland is actually making the same argument for lowering the threshold in its submission to the current South Africa versus Israel case, Sands says that the idea of genocide should be he also says that it should be abandoned. He says despite his respect for Lemkin, he was not sure if it was a socially useful thing to invent the concept of genocide. Indeed, he claimed that its invention may actually have given rise to more genocide, as the political use of the genocide idea inflames passions in situations like Gaza. So, in the face of these arguments, my purpose today is to reclaim the idea of genocide as a serious sociological and legal concept. First of all, let me stake out some more common ground with the critics. I have long argued that the field of armed conflict, and specifically war and genocide, need to be studied as a whole. I agree that with Moses that paranoid permanent security is a major rationale for violence. And I also agree with him that violence committed by liberal states, which is often called war and justified by military necessity, has much in common with violence by illiberal states, which is more often labelled genocide. And I agree with Sands that the threshold that the judges have erected has steered genocide law into a cul-de-sac, and that unless the judges revise their approach, it will remain compromised. However, after a full year of the new conflict in Gaza, during which the idea of genocide has returned so forcefully, both in public life and in proceedings in The Hague, it seems strange to propose that scholars and lawyers should abandon the idea. It is Hamas atrocities and the even more terrible Israeli response that have inflamed passions over the last year, not the idea of genocide which has given these passions expression. It is perfectly possible to discuss these crimes using alternative descriptive terms, massacre, brutality, torture, starvation, and alternative legal concepts, war crimes, crimes against humanity, as Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, has done. But is it really possible, let alone desirable, to banish the idea of genocide from discourse about these actions? And would not the socio-historical sciences and international law diminish themselves in the public eye should they attempt to rule out this potent idea? Now, to answer these questions, let us ask what genocide would add to Khan's indictment and to our understanding of Gaza as social scientists and historians. And this statement by Lemkin here cannot be bettered, I think, as an answer to that question. And this dates from 1933, you'll see. This is a full decade before he published his book with the word genocide, but a full decade before that he was already developing the idea, which he then called barbarism instead of genocide. The crucial thing that he's saying here is, after listing massacres, atrocities, and brutalities in a similar way to the charge sheet that the ICC prosecutor drew up against the Hamas leaders and against the Israeli leaders, Lemkin argues, taken separately, all these acts are punishable in the respective codes. Considered together, however, they should constitute offences against the law of nations by reason of their common feature, which is to endanger both the existence of the collectivity concerned and the entire social order. There he means the sort of global social order. So, in addition to taking the separate crimes, the crimes separately, torture, starvation, and so on, he says we need to take them together. We need to ask if there is a common purpose in these crimes, an overall genocidal intent, if you like, to use the language which has become common since the convention. So the idea of genocide is the idea of taking the methods of attack together as a whole, examining the general threat to the population which is intended in them. And it therefore stands in relation to the specific types of anti-civilian violence in a similar way to the crime of aggression. The crime of aggression, which so argued that Russia has committed in the case of Ukraine, is the crime of an illegitimate attack on another state or nation. The crime of genocide is an illegitimate attack on a whole population or a whole population group, and this is what Lemkin is trying to draw our attention to. So where a war includes only isolated violations of civilians, it may be appropriate to confine our discussion to the existence of war crimes. Or when it only concerns one particular method, maybe to one particular crime against humanity. But when anti-civilian violence is comprehensive and multi-pronged, it inevitably raises the question of whether civilians are being treated as an enemy in themselves, whose social and cultural relations and identity the perpetrators intend to destroy. Now, here are Karim Khan's charges. I have considerable respect for Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, but so far, as you can see from his charges, although it's an impressive list of charges, these are the charges against Israeli leaders. Of course, there are also a list of charges against Hamas leaders, which is equally comprehensive and equally damning. These charges, though, they swerve the question of the overall intent. And I suppose the question that can be asked, that I want to ask about the Gaza situation in relation to these charges is it really credible to treat all of these many means that Israel has used to destroy Gazans the Palestinians in Gaza, physically and socially, as merely a set of discrete crimes in the way this list does? And can we really ignore the issue of Israel's overall hostility and destructive animus towards the Gazan population, of which there has been such extensive evidence in its own speeches? And of course, this has been in the public domain for a whole year now, and in the International Court of Justice in January this year, the president of the court quoted extensively from the statements of Israeli leaders showing this hostility to the Palestinian population of Gaza as a whole. And we can ask, if Israel's leaders' words were not themselves sufficient, doesn't the pattern of its actions over the last 12 months necessarily raise this issue? Could Israel really have destroyed Gaza almost by accident in its pursuit of Hamas? Could it have not have intended its near total destruction of Gazan society? Is it really conceivable that this was not one of the objectives of its onslaught, alongside, of course, the destruction of Hamas? Let us recall that as early as 2006, in its bombing of Lebanon, Israel already developed a norm of disproportionate response against civilians, known as its Dahir doctrine. And in 2008, 2014, 2021, Israel bombed Gaza, killing thousands of civilians and destroying whole neighborhoods. So my argument would be that when Israel launched its offensive against Gaza in October last year, it certainly knew that a bombardment which was many times more powerful than the previous attacks would produce the near total destruction which has occurred. And it must have known this even more concretely when it continued the policy after this effect was visible. And of course, this effect was visible by the end of last year. And very recently, Israel's Prime Minister has effectively acknowledged its intentional character when he threatened Lebanon with a long war that will lead to destruction and suffering like we see in Gaza. in a sense, that seems to be an ownership of that destruction which has been committed. Now, the conflation of the two sides of Israel's campaign, the military campaign against Hamas and the attack on the Gazan population, this has been aided by the fact that the destruction of the population has effectively been accomplished, or at least initially was accomplished, mainly through the same method, bombardment, that was used to attack Hamas. And this enabled Israel to use the laws of war as what the United Nations rapporteur Francesca Albanese has called humanitarian camouflage, by wrapping up its individual actions in a claim of following the laws of war, even while producing this overwhelming disruptive effect. And among legal authorities, and indeed among states, this has caused what two scholars have called doctrinal confusion, hampering the law's capacity to prevent the harm that it's causing. Now, because, of course, the case that has been brought to the International Court of Justice is a case asking the court to issue measures to try and prevent the ongoing harm. And so these lawyers are saying that this doctrinal confusion around the relationship between the laws of war and the laws of genocide is hampering the ability of the courts to achieve that. But as the conflict has lengthened, Israel has increasingly committed acts directed primarily against civilians. And of course, this is where the restriction of food supply and medicines and things like that comes in, which is difficult to explain except as a deliberate destructive policy against the population. So when the ICJ returned to the case in March and May this year, it was the risk of famine and starvation which became the main focus of its new instructions to Israel, which of course have not been by any means fully complied with. And it was also top of Karim Khan's charge sheet in the International Criminal Court. Therefore, I would argue that Israel has had both military and genocidal intentions in Gaza. And Sands sees these as a potential get-out course for the court. Because if you have more than one intent, the court might conclude, as in the Bosnian case, that genocide cannot be proven. However, from where I stand, the opposite conclusion might be more appropriate. If Hamas and Gazan society are both enemies for Israel, and it seeks to destroy them both, and the campaign is directed simultaneously at both, then it is surely the idea that genocide is the only reasonable inference which is to be questioned. Now, Israel's fatal hostility towards the Gazan population cuts a common theme in Moses and Sands' arguments, which is to downplay the group element in mass violence. But I believe these are far from rendering the idea of genocide unnecessary. Because if we think about the historical cases, the Nazis deported the Dutch Jews in the same war in which they starved the general population and bombed Rotterdam. So these different types of violence occurring in the same war need to be shown in connection as well as treated as separate cases. We need both the idea of how these events are combined, but we also need to be able to name them in distinctive ways. And this is what the idea of genocide does, and this is why Lemkin introduced it in the way that he did. And I think that what we have in modern wars is the idea that genocide, that the group element of the targeting of populations is a common theme. But if the group is regarded as a specific target, if there is the specific hostility towards a population group which drives the violence against it, in addition to the overriding prosecution of the war against an enemy state, then that is a specific type of crime, and that is something which needs to be recognized by an idea like genocide. Now, so I think that genocide is a necessary naming concept for violence, but it can also have explanatory power. And in order to demonstrate this, I want to talk a little bit more about the dynamics of the Gaza conflict and go back to Hamas actions on the 7th of October last year. This was not a daring military attack in which Israeli civilians happened to die. It was a deliberate attack on civilians in the kibbutzim of southern Israel, expanded then to include the young people who were attending a music festival. Many scholars have called these war crimes or atrocities, but I argued from the start that it was important to recognize their genocidal character, that Hamas was targeting civilians because they were Israelis in the context of Israeli society, and that we can call in aid the important idea of the genocidal massacre, a form of genocide which is short of an all-out destruction of our total population, a concept which was proposed by the anthropologist Leo Cooper about 40 years ago. And I think this label of genocidal massacre is important not only for conceptual consistency, for putting Hamas actions and Israeli actions to the extent that they should be compared for comparing them, but also to explain the dynamic of events. The Israeli government would have been humiliated by any large Hamas incursion, but the genocidal character of Hamas attack turned regime humiliation into national trauma. And this is what has powered the extraordinary drive for vengeance not only by Israeli leaders, but also by a large part of the Israeli population since last October. And it's this trauma, of course, which also fitted the episode so easily into the history of Jewish victimization and anti-Semitism, and enabled the West to give Israel a license for mass killing, which has been visible over the last year. So this genocidal dynamic, as I would call it, has had large consequences for the character of this war. And it's had consequences for Israel's enemies as well. So for Iran and Hezbollah and the Houthis, who might have wanted to avoid an all-out war with Israel, they have had to some extent to stand up against Israel in this case because of the perceived genocidal character of the onslaught on Gaza's population. So in all these ways, I think this aspect of the conflict has contributed to its expansion. And I think we can say, and I have argued this in previous work, that there was already, in a certain sense, a genocidal structure in Palestine, and the events of the Nakba in 1948 can be seen as a way in which the genocidal potential of a settler colonial society could be activated into an active process of mass victimization. But and this experience of historic victimization has contributed to the formation of stronger and stronger group identities, as well as to the extremely important global symbolic importance of the Israel-Palestine concept. So what Hamas attacks and Israel's response have done is to reactivate this structure and potential of genocide that was already present in the Israel-Palestine conflict and already evoked by the references to the historic victimization of the Jews, which underlay so much of Israel's own growth. So I hope you can begin to see, in ways that I've had to, if you like, compress a bit in this presentation, that genocide can be a flexible concept. The genocide historian Raz Segal called Gaza a textbook genocide. But I don't think it makes sense to think from a sociological or historical point of view about genocide as a single format event. There isn't a single textbook concept of genocide which can just be fitted to a particular situation. There are legal criteria. There have to be definitional criteria, which I have worked on myself. But genocide is a broad category of actions and conflicts. It's a concept a bit like war, to which it is closely related. And it is a highly variable phenomenon. So the Nakba is very different from the Holocaust. And the Gaza conflict is very different from the Nakba. A textbook genocide is no more possible than a textbook war. Therefore, each genocide is a changeable, dynamic phenomenon and process. Israel's genocide began with mass slaughter through bombardment, apparently aiming at the disintegration of Gazan society. Now, amidst a seemingly endless war, we have what one international relations scholar has called a genocide of attrition. And this harks back to what Lemkin was thinking about when he suggested that the idea of genocide could be seen more broadly, or that it didn't just cover mass killing, it also covered, for example, what he called the crippling of a national group through the production of famine and starvation. He said, a daily fight literally for bread and for physical survival may handicap thinking in both general and national terms. So genocide cannot be not only the killing of a whole population, but also their reduction to a state of poverty and total insecurity, and to a constant fight for survival. Now, in the case of Gaza, I don't think that we know where this is going to end. Many Israeli leaders would like it to lead with the expulsion of the survivors, the surviving population, but this seems unlikely because it's blocked by Egypt and by other powers. More probable, I think, is a new hunger winter in the months to come. This terrible process seems destined to continue, and no end is in sight. But the end is not predetermined. And really this relates back, I suppose, to Lemkin's original motive in introducing the idea of genocide. If the United Nations, United States, the West in general, were to force Israel to halt the war or relinquish its occupation of Gaza, the recovery of the surviving population could start to begin. Some might say that this lecture has been too much about Gaza. Well, I think after what has happened in the last 12 months, it would have been difficult for it not to have been about Gaza. Philippe Sands argued that if the International Court of Justice recognized genocide in one case, then it might open the floodgates and it might find itself addressing genocide claims about every civil war that is going on. And this conjures up the idea of the abuse of the idea of genocide. Now, obviously, the idea of genocide is abused. I think when Russia claimed that it could intervene in Ukraine to protect Russian speakers because they were suffering genocide, that was an abuse of the genocide idea. But there are many more wars, like those of the last decade in Syria, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Sudan, and of course Russia's own campaign in Ukraine, which have very strongly involved what we can call genocide, even in the Convention's terms and certainly in Lemkin's terms. And the idea that the pervasiveness of a crime could be a reason for narrowing its application doesn't seem to me to be a very strong argument for the idea of law. We have to face the reality that what is happening in Gaza in some ways is a symbol of a much wider problem which is happening in so many places which are too much forgotten in the debates that are going on. So my argument today concludes with the idea that the return of genocide as an idea, which Gaza has brought about, should be welcomed. And this is because genocide as lived reality, as an experience of too many populations, has not gone away. Social scientific language, historical language, should never be a slave to political fashion, or indeed to legal usage. But it would seem perverse for the academic study of mass violence to turn away from the idea of genocide just when it has gained this massive relevance to so many people worldwide. And at the time when, arguably, the activists in the university encampments, as well as the lawyers in the International Criminal Court, are following in Lemkin's footsteps in attempting to pinpoint this huge, terrible problem in world politics. So we have an opportunity to provide a coherent account of these destructive processes which are too common in our world, and genocide is an indispensable idea that we must use in this task to help to overcome them. Thank you.
Martin, thank you very much for this tour d'horizon that is both empirical and theoretical. We have about 20 minutes for a formal Q&A session. After that, we will continue our conversations and discussions at the reception. Since I have the microphone, I will be so bold as to ask the first question. Martin, you used a few times the term genocidal. So do you feel perhaps that actually that genocide, not as a noun, but it actually works better as an adjective? For example, in terms of genocidal massacre or genocidal war?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that logically genocide can be used both as a noun as an adjective. I think we can talk about genocide as a phenomenon, in whole, just like we talk about war as a general phenomenon. I was doing that some of the time. We can talk about a genocide, a specific episode, which constitutes a large-scale constellation of genocidal acts, and that's what we're doing when we talk about major cases. We can also talk about genocidal massacres. That was another idea I introduced, which is the idea of more smaller scale, more localized examples of genocide. So I talked about Hamas actions in southern Israel as genocidal massacres because these were short-lived, very deadly, but short-lived destructions of particular communities, and there was no prospect, given the balance of power, that Hamas could have committed a larger scale, total atrocity against the Israeli people. So that's an example of where adjectival terminology, I think, is useful. But I think when we come to large-scale, long-lasting events of historic kind, which fundamentally change the relations in a particular area, then I think we need the idea of a genocide. We need the idea that particularly these sorts of events constitute fundamental violations of what it means to have a human society, and therefore need to be categorized in this specific way with this terminology which Lemkin helped to introduce.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to stand up. We have a microphone here in the middle. If you have a question, please come to the microphone. You can also line up, that's also totally fine, and then we'll see how many questions we can go through. So if you want, you can please say your name if you want to, and ask your question to Professor Shaw.
My name is George Benker.
Can you leave the microphone on the thing?
So, okay, it works now?
Can you click in the microphone? Well, you can also talk in your hand, that's fine, go ahead.
I'm a little bit tall, so maybe that's why I had to hold it. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't understand. Genocide is the question whether Israel can be convicted of that. I'm looking at the list of the prosecutor, and I wonder, do you only look at that convention, or do you also look at like ABC conventions, like phosphorus is being used, like whatever is called in the Geneva Conventions is like you can't, you mentioned the medicines, kill medical personnel, bomb hospitals, journalists. There are so many, and another one, more than 60 laws are racist. It may lead to apartheid. If it doesn't work towards the definition of genocide, is then the judge rested by saying it's barbarism? What is going to happen, what you feel in The Hague? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm not sure I completely heard properly. I mean, there's a bit of distortion with the microphones, I think. I mean, these are simply the crimes that have been alleged by the International Criminal Court's prosecutor against the two Israeli leaders. And as I said, there is a similar list of crimes, different but comparable, against Hamas leaders. These are all specific items in the charge sheet. I mean, and there could be more. I think you were mentioning the use of phosphorus and other means of, there could be, I mean, clearly the prosecutor has to select what he or she sees as the most viable charges, and that's what they've done. The argument about genocide, I mean, I hope I'm not repeating what you already understand, but I mean, the argument about genocide is that behind all of these different charges, we could argue that the Israeli leaders have an overarching aim, which is to reduce Gaza to rubble, which is to impoverish, if not to remove the population, the Palestinian population of Gaza. And that to the extent that they have that aim, that to the extent that their actions show that sort of purpose, then we can talk about genocide in the overarching, the common sense that Lemkin suggested all those decades ago.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So this question relates to specifically cultural genocide and
Right.
complicity. So following the October 7th attacks by Hamas, the IDF banned the portrayal of the Palestinian flag in Gaza and the West Bank. This has been done before, for example, by the German occupation in the Netherlands. If you would look at the definition you wrote of genocide in your book, What is Genocide, and the UNESCO 1981 declaration you quoted, this does constitute cultural genocide because it, quote, denies an ethnic group the right to enjoy its own culture. But to extrapolate from that, Meta has, or social media platforms owned by Meta, have been proven to shadow ban posts with Palestinian flags, resulting in Palestinian voices and activists for Palestinian voices being suppressed in online discourse, and also the adoption of the watermelon emoji as a symbol. Do you think future scholarships definitions should also reserve a role for media, both traditional and social?
I think The question of media and social media is a very important one, because really that is where most of our politics is carried on, primarily carried on today. And when you mentioned the shadow banning by Meta, I was reminded that about a week ago I discovered that an article that I wrote in October last year, on October the 13th last year, I wrote an article which included the title, The Spectre of Genocide. And at that stage I said that it appeared that Hamas had committed genocidal massacres, and that Israel's response already raised, this was 6 days after October the 7th, the problem of the spectre of even larger genocide. And that article I posted onto Facebook in October 2023. It stayed there quite happily, or maybe not happily, it wasn't really much noticed until October 2024, and then about a week ago, or 10 days ago, I suddenly received a notice saying it had been removed because it contravened their policies. I forget exactly what they said. So I think that's certainly going on. On the more, the bigger questions, I mean, clearly, Lemkin believed, as I said, that Lemkin believed that the suppression of culture was an inherent part of genocide, and indeed he tended often towards seeing that as the most important part. In the way in which genocide has subsequently been defined by most people, especially by the UN Convention, that has become less prominent in the definition. But I think it's reasonable to say that any destruction of intentional destruction of a population group must includes a cultural dimension, and clearly there is the attempt to destroy the cultural representations of Palestinian life in Gaza, the destruction of mosques, the destruction of universities, schools, etc. It's been very, very well documented as part of what is going on. So I would agree that's an important part of it. I think, I mean, it clearly has to be seen in relation to the general destruction of life, of the conditions of life, and of the integrity of that society in the Gaza Strip. It's one of the dimensions. That's how I would understand it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you for your fascinating reflection. I have a more conceptual question in line with the topic of your lecture,
Yes.
Which is even the broader definitions of genocide as conceptualized by Lemkin, which include things like political groups, are still based on a division of our societies along relatively modern lines. And there have been movements within historiography and political science that have proposed categorizing instances of historical violence as genocide as well, going back to the Middle Ages and even ancient times. And I'm wondering if you personally feel that there is a point at which the concept of genocide as we understand it now is no longer meaningful when applied to historical cases. Thank you.
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think genocide is a modern concept which primarily describes modern forms of ancient violence. I mean, clearly the violence against populations is hardly something which is unique to the modern age. It has existed throughout large-scale civilizations of the last 10,000 years or so, and it's been part of warfare. Warfare has been very terrible for civilian populations in all periods of recorded history. But Lemkin, I think, had it right when he said that the way we can recognize genocide as something distinct from war is through the way in which war has been increasingly defined as something which is legitimate when it occurs between armies and between states. So between sovereigns and armies, I think were his words. And this is a specific modern doctrine. So the paradox is that because of the modern laws of war, which define when war is legitimate and when it isn't, and what kind of actions within war are legitimate and what are not, it is easier to recognize the violence against populations as something distinct, something which is not a normal part of warfare anymore, which is something which is particular to, which can be described by this new concept, as a concept by the concept of genocide. So I think that's an important insight, and of course it creates the paradox that as war has been apparently more regulated by international humanitarian norms, at the same time, violence against populations has become more and more recognizable as a distinct problem. And unfortunately, not as a small problem, but as a very large and arguably growing problem. And this is, in this sense, this is a modern idea. We're describing modern realities, but clearly, it has all sorts of echoes back. Once we have the idea of genocide, once we can use this to identify violence against whole civilian populations, then it becomes interesting, perhaps, to explore ways in which it can be applied to previous periods. And that's what some historians have done, and I don't think we should rule that out by some sort of fiat. I think that could be illuminating, but we have to recognise these changes that have taken place, because the way in which war is affecting civilians is in modern times has very distinct characteristics. So we've had this phenomenon of total mobilization warfare, especially in the world wars, the whole population mobilized for war, and then the flip side of that, the whole population becomes the target of the enemy attack. So there are very distinct modern features which, the echo of things that have happened in earlier periods, but which are taking new forms in modern times, and that seems to me to be one of the core insights here.
Thank you for your speech. My name is Sayes. I want to follow up on your last word. If you look at wars in medieval and earlier periods, the population was the weapon. If you wanted to destroy a society, you had to destroy the population. And now, with the modern wars starting actually, which we saw already in the Vietnam War, where the population was the weapon, because the weapon, the guerrilla, couldn't exist without the population. In itself, the civilian population became a kind of, and I have no other word, legitimate target, because you couldn't kill the army without killing the surrounding population. So I understand the scientific validity of your concept of genocide. I understand the political meaning of it, but if you look at a situation like in Israel and Palestine, it's a typical situation of guerrilla warfare in an urban environment. So in those situations, and that doesn't mean that I condone it, but in those situations, it becomes virtually impossible to fight your enemy without killing or destroying the surrounding society. So, and then the question is, not so much for me, whether it's a genocide or whether it's a crime against humanity, because if the differentiating characteristic between the two is intent, okay, you can discuss about that. But it has to do with specific war. I personally, I don't think that the aggression war that the Russians wage against Ukrainians will develop into to a genocide, as Lemkin meant, because of it's a different kind of war. All those wars which start, go to their climax, and peter out in situations comparable, like we saw it in Vietnam, we saw it in Srebrenica, we see it in Gaza, and if Hamas would have had more military power, we would have seen it in Israel. So I don't know. I think it's more important to start to differentiate the goals of warfare than whether it's a crime against humanity or a genocide. And what's your opinion about that?
Thank you.
Yes. Well, I think it's certainly important to see what states and other actors are trying to achieve in their military campaigns, against each other, and it is certainly true that modern insurgencies and counterinsurgency warfare typically involves violence against civilian populations, and that we see this right across the board in many different cases. But I think there is still the question, really, of to the extent to which the civilian population is regarded by one of the actors as an enemy in itself, to the extent to which they have objectives which are defined explicitly or implicitly against the civilian population. And I think we can distinguish to some extent between different cases along these lines. So I think, for example, although all the wars that have been fought by the United States and its allies since Vietnam and in recent decades have involved extensive civilian casualties, I don't think there are many cases in which we have seen the sort of explicit hostility towards the civilian population of the areas in which these wars have been fought that we see in the case of Israel's hostility towards the Gazan population. And we don't see, although we see many civilian casualties, we don't see the same level of civilian casualties in relation to the population that we see in Gaza. So, although some people have said, well, that what Israel is doing in Gaza is just what the Americans have done in Afghanistan and various other places, or Iraq. And there are obviously some similarities, but I think there's also a significant difference. I think there is because of the particular structure of the Israel-Palestine conflict and the aims of Israeli leaders to create an expanded Israeli state in larger areas of Palestine, which have been going on for a long time now. I think this is the levels of anti-Palestinian racism as well in Israel, which is often not mentioned. We talk a lot, and quite rightly, about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but actually anti-Palestinian racism is really very strong factor here, I think. I think this is why, for me, this situation raises questions of genocide in addition to any other considerations, that it stands apart to some extent from the general range of recent counterinsurgency warfare.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, we have space for one more question. So please go ahead, Annelies, and then we can continue our conversations over the reception.
Thank you. I'll keep it short. Thank you for your thought-provoking lecture, and I've written my question down to keep it short, actually. So in your lecture, you speak of the concept of genocide and plead, contrary to other scholars, to the continuation of the use of it. And you speak here of genocide as I think interchangeably, as a historical, legal, and social construct. And as a historian of mass violence of the Soviet Union and the Holodomor, for example, I often find that in scholarly debates, you quickly turn into a very binary question of yes or no, was it genocide or not? And in a way, it seems to paralyze the debate and sort of leads away from important questions because, as you say, it leads to, or in this case, it leads to misunderstandings about the concept because historians actually apply a highly politicized judicial concept to a historical situation. So I was wondering, the concept of genocide that you plead for here, is that a social or a legal or a historical concept? And if you do not distinguish between them, how do you see to keep the discussion constructive and not just binary?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, there are a couple of different issues involved there. I mean, one is the question about the relationship between sociological, historical, and legal concepts. And I don't really see a difference between sociological and historical concepts. I mean, I see sociological ideas as conceptual tools for historical research, and I see sociology and history as part of the field of social and historical sciences, which work ideally ought to be working together. So I advocate for what I call a sociological concept, but I mean it as something to be used in understanding historical processes. That is somewhat different from the legal concept. The legal concept obviously is defined by the convention and by subsequent jurisprudence and has very particular criteria which are in some cases I think at odds with more coherent social historical understanding, and so I think there's a potential tension there. I think that I think that it's important that social and historical understanding pays attention to legal concepts and legal arguments. I think that more fundamentally the law needs to be in line with coherent sociological and historical understanding, and I think sometimes it isn't. The rest of your question, it's gone out. Yes, binary. Sorry. Yes. I do think that we need to try and move beyond this question of whether the given case is genocide or not. I don't think that is obviously a key question in the political debates. From the point of view of understanding what's going on, that isn't the only question, or necessarily the most important question. So I was trying to show in my discussion of the relationships between the Hamas genocidal massacres, as I called them, and the Israeli genocide in Gaza, and the connections of both with the dynamic regional conflict which is unfolding. I tried to show that genocide can be used in a historical analysis in a dynamic way, and I think that is from our point of view as academics, as sociologists and historians, that is more important in the end than the categorizing particular actions in a certain way. But nevertheless, the question of category is an important one. Otherwise, I wouldn't have given this lecture, because I think that there is so much there's so much tendency to push against the recognition of genocide, and I think it is such a pervasive problem. Obviously it's not everywhere and anywhere. It isn't happening in the Netherlands. It isn't happening in many parts of the world. It isn't happening. But in the countries that I mentioned, it's not just in Gaza. It's not just in Ukraine. It's not. It's also. We see what's happening in Sudan. I think a lot of what is happening in Sudan could reasonably be described as genocide, and the genocidal aspect to it and its relationship to earlier episodes of genocide in Darfur 20 years ago are important aspects of our understanding of the whole process. So I suppose that's my answer to that.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. Thank you all for attending. We noticed that these conversations are, of course, not over. That's why we always have a reception after the lecture, so you can ask questions to the speaker also in person if you'd like to. But please, for now, allow me to give a big applause to Martin Shaw for
Thank you.